I've been into the Far Cry series ever since my first foray into Far Cry 2, and since 3, I've felt that they've been unmatched in terms of providing so many styles of play at such a consistently high quality. With Far Cry 5, it's time to see if that polished, jack-of-all-trades approach to gameplay is maintained alongside the game's shift to a setting that feels more relevant to modern Western audiences. Far Cry 5 is set in the fictional Hope County, Montana, where a cult of Christian-flavored religious extremists have risen to power under the guiding hand of their charismatic preacher, Father Joseph Seed, and his family. The player takes the role of a deputy at the county sheriff's office, who, as part of an operation to arrest this religious leader, becomes stranded in hostile territory and is forced to save their law enforcement colleagues to finish the job they started and escape. The idea of a militant extremist Christian cult occupying American soil is an interesting concept, but Far Cry 5's biggest failing is that it doesn't really flesh the cult out or do anything substantial with them. They're just a generic evil doomsday cult, and the game ineffectually insists on trying to make you sympathize with the cult via its tragic leaders. Despite this goal, you're not exposed to any beliefs or dogma to sway you to their side, so it all falls rather flat. This isn't helped by the fact that their tragic backstories are inconsistent, ranging from recovering drug addicts to that one guy on your Facebook who is livid about the existence of participation trophies. That's not to say that they aren't entertaining to watch as they spout their Saturday morning cartoon villain bullshit, it's just that they're almost impossible to relate with, which is clearly the intent. In addition to that, the majority of Hope County's normal residents are flag-waving, gun-toting nationalists, and maybe it's just me, but in this day and age, I find it super hard to want to support these people. I mean, in comparison to gun-toting evil doomsday cults, I guess I'll help the gun-toting conservatives, but I won't be happy about it. Far Cry 5 seems like it's trying to say something, but ultimately feels like a safe story where nothing really gets said. On top of its underwhelming story, Far Cry 5 also comes up short mechanically. While not out-and-out bad, certain aspects just don't feel as polished as they once were. Combat remains as straightforward as ever and allows for some pretty fun and fast encounters. However, the inclusion of heavily armored troops and nearly static damage output means that every so often the action just grinds to a halt as you scramble to find cover and explosives to waste. Even when you aren't dealing with these bullet sponges, you have to babysit the frankly suicidal AI buddies that the game encourages you to take along for the ride. You would think then that stealth is still an option, and while it is, the mechanics just aren't implemented as well as in previous games. Takedowns are still as brutally satisfying as ever, and avoiding officially alerting enemies is simple enough, but I found that hostiles would just randomly start searching for me for no discernible reason. I tried using arrows, silenced guns, and melee takedowns, but no matter what, as soon as a single enemy was taken out, their allies would start running around looking for me, even if I was nowhere near anything. I figured this was the buddy AI alerting enemies, but it continued happening even after I decided to get rid of them. So I'm at a loss for how the enemy AI was so impossibly aware of everything around them at all times. This is particularly jarring, as I've always felt the stealth mechanics in previous Far Cry games were always some of the more polished, satisfying aspects of those games. The moment-to-moment gameplay isn't the only thing that feels like a step backwards. The decision to move away from crafted upgrades means that all progression becomes a homogenized perk system, practically making hunting a waste of time in the process. That's not to say that there haven't been any improvements made to the Far Cry formula. For example, the radio towers made famous by Ubisoft games of the past are practically nowhere to be found in Far Cry 5. As a result, you find the game's side content by simply exploring the world. At the end of the day though, I'm not sure if this is an overall improvement, as you end up wasting time in this empty feeling world trying to find people to give you things to do, and there's just so much empty space to explore with the game's historically average vehicle gameplay. Actually, to be fair, Far Cry 5 did manage to add some new vehicle types into the mix, and while the car and quad bikes are still merely okay to drive, the planes do wind up being quite fun, especially when you get into a dogfight in the skies above Hope County. To its credit, Hope County, as big and empty as it is, does look very nice, and it feels somewhat alive thanks to the roaming citizens and cultists who travel the roads, and the multitude of animals just waiting for you to let your guard down. As well as looking good, Far Cry 5 nails its sound design, and any given moment in-game is peppered with the sound of thundering guns, roaring engines, and, again, the sounds of various animals stalking you. Probably the game's best element is the voice work for the antagonistic Seed family. Despite the game's lackluster attempt to make them sympathetic, these characters do deliver their lines in such a way that, even if they don't come off as realistically evil, they're unquestionably entertaining and magnetic. At the end of the day, Far Cry 5 feels like a missed opportunity. The game's story fails to do anything interesting with its brilliant core concept, while almost all of the game's mechanics either settle for the quality of previous titles, or worse, take a step backwards. It's not necessarily a bad game, but after at least 3 really excellent entries into the series, it's disappointing to see this come up so short. With that said, Far Cry 5 is mediocre. If this was my first Far Cry game, I'd probably be more forgiving of the game's less polished aspects, but it isn't, and it really doesn't hold up well when compared to previous games. So if this is your first Far Cry game, then it'll provide a good enough time, but it's hard to not just point you in the direction of Far Cry 3, 4, Blood Dragon, or Primal instead. If you're a Far Cry veteran, maybe hold off until this drops in price.